The road stretched endlessly across America's highways, cutting through quiet towns, empty fields, and long forgotten stretches of pavement. For most people, a journey like this would be exhausting. For one man, it was personal. He had already lost his freedom once. Now, step by step, mile by mile, he was driven by something far more dangerous than exhaustion, a sense of betrayal he could not release. By the time authorities realized he was gone, he was already hundreds of miles away. No car, no phone, no money, only a destination fixed firmly in his mind. And before this journey ended, a life would be lost. This is the true crime story of an escaped inmate, a 740-mile walk across multiple states, and a marriage that ended in tragedy. Long before the escape, before the manhunt and the headlines, there was a relationship that once seemed ordinary from the outside. The woman at the center of this story was known by friends as quiet and reliable. She worked steadily, kept her life private, and tried to move forward despite a complicated past. Her husband, however, carried a very different history. He had repeated encounters with the criminal justice system, arrests, convictions, years spent behind prison walls. When they first met, he was intense and persuasive, someone who could appear charming one moment and unsettling the next. Despite concerns from those around her, the relationship progressed quickly. At first, it felt like devotion. Over time, it became control. Friends would later recall arguments that seemed excessive, emotional pressure that never eased, and jealousy that lingered beneath everything. Eventually, the law intervened again. He was sentenced to prison, leaving his wife on the outside, alone, uncertain, and struggling to rebuild her life. For a while, she tried to stay connected. Phone calls, letters, promises that things would be different when he was released. But prison has a way of stopping time for one person while life continues for everyone else. As months turned into years, the emotional distance grew. She began to move forward, finding stability, reconnecting with old friends, and imagining a future that no longer revolved around prison schedules and monitored calls. Inside the prison, her husband experienced that change very differently. To him, distance felt like abandonment. Silence felt like betrayal. Rumors, whether true or imagined, began to take hold. Other inmates later recalled how often he spoke about his wife, how conversations returned again and again to loyalty, trust, and revenge, how he blamed her for her sentence, his isolation, and his anger. When he learned that she had moved on with her life, something inside him shifted. Correctional officers would later say the day he disappeared seemed unremarkable at first. No immediate alarms, no chaos, just an absence. A routine head count revealed a mistake no one wanted to believe. An inmate was missing. By the time the facility went into lockdown, he was already gone. What followed was not a dramatic chase or a sudden confrontation. It was something slower. A man traveling on foot, crossing state lines, driven by obsession. Each mile brought him closer to a woman who had no idea he was coming.
The prison where he was held sat far from the highways and cities most people knew. Surrounded by fencing, watchtowers, and strict routines, it was designed to prevent exactly what happened next. Investigators would later piece together the escape slowly, step by step. There was no dramatic explosion of violence, no high-speed getaway. Instead, it was a series of small failures, a moment of opportunity, a lack of supervision, and a man who had been planning far longer than anyone realized. At some point during the day, he slipped away from his assigned area. Whether it was through a maintenance route, an unsecured section, or a lapse in procedure would later become a matter of internal review. What mattered was the result. He was outside the perimeter. By the time prison staff noticed he was missing, valuable hours had already passed. Those hours gave him distance, and distance gave him confidence. Authorities immediately issued alerts to surrounding agencies. Roadblocks were discussed, search teams were deployed, but there was a problem. No one expected him to travel the way he did. He wasn't stealing a car, he wasn't hiding in a nearby town, he was walking. From the moment he left the prison grounds, his journey became an exercise in endurance and obsession. Day after day, he followed roads, railroad tracks, and back routes that kept him away from attention. He slept wherever he could, wooded areas, abandoned structures, hidden spaces that offered brief shelter. Food was scarce, water was rationed, but his determination only seemed to grow stronger. To investigators, it would later become clear that this was not a spontaneous decision. This was a mission. Inside his mind, the miles weren't an obstacle, they were a countdown. With every step, he replayed memories of his marriage, arguments, phone calls that ended too quickly, letters that stopped coming. The idea that his wife had moved on consumed him. Psychologists who later reviewed the case would describe his mindset as deeply fixated, a pattern where perceived betrayal became justification for action. Meanwhile, on the outside, his wife was living a life she believed was finally stable. She had distanced herself from the chaos of the past. She had rebuilt routines, relationships, and a sense of normalcy. What she didn't know was that her past was walking toward her. Law enforcement agencies tracked tips as they came in, vague sightings, reports of a man matching his description moving through small towns. But without a vehicle, without digital traces, he remained difficult to locate. Each state he crossed added complexity to the search, and as the days passed, concern grew. Because investigators understood something important. This was not a man running away. This was a man heading toward something. By the time he reached the final stretch of his journey, his physical condition had deteriorated, but his focus had sharpened. He knew where he was going. He knew who he wanted to see. What he did not fully understand was how irreversible his next decision would be. The confrontation did not happen in public view. There were no witnesses who understood the danger in time. What followed would leave a permanent mark, not just on the people involved, but on everyone who would later examine the case. And when authorities finally caught up to him, the journey that had begun with an escape would end with a crime that could not be undone. The moment he arrived, there was no dramatic announcement of his presence, no warning, no chance for preparation. For his wife, it began as an ordinary day. She followed a familiar routine, work, errands, brief conversations with people who knew nothing about the danger approaching her life. She believed the chapter involving her husband had closed the moment he was sentenced. She was wrong. Investigators would later determine that he waited before making contact. He observed, he thought, he rehearsed what he would say. To him, this was not an ambush. It was a confrontation he believed had been earned. When the two finally came face to face, the tension was immediate. Years of unresolved conflict resurfaced in moments. Witnesses would later describe raised voices, a conversation that escalated quickly, a situation that felt unstable from the very beginning. What happened next unfolded rapidly. Details would later emerge through evidence, statements, and forensic analysis, carefully documented and examined during the investigation. What authorities confirmed was this: the encounter turned fatal. Emergency services were called, but it was already too late. The woman did not survive. The man who had walked hundreds of miles to reach her stood at the center of a scene that would soon become the focus of a multi-agency investigation. Law enforcement arrived quickly. The area was secured. Investigators began documenting everything: the location, the condition of the scene, and the timeline leading up to the confrontation. The suspect did not attempt to flee. After days of movement, exhaustion, and fixation, his journey was over. He was taken into custody without resistance. Officers noted his physical condition immediately. He appeared malnourished, fatigued, and emotionally detached. During questioning, his statements reflected a mindset investigators would later describe as rigid and emotionally driven. He spoke about betrayal, about loyalty, about a belief that he had been wronged. But belief did not change the facts. Evidence confirmed that he had escaped custody, traveled across multiple states, and confronted his wife in a way that resulted in her death. The case quickly drew national attention. Media coverage focused on the extraordinary distance he had traveled, the 740-mile journey that turned an escape into a homicide investigation. But for those closest to the victim, the numbers meant very little. What mattered was the loss. As detectives continued their work, they began reconstructing the final days leading up to the confrontation. Surveillance footage, witness accounts, forensic findings. Each piece added clarity. What emerged was a portrait of a man consumed by resentment and control, unable to accept that life had continued without him. Psychological experts later testified that his actions followed a familiar pattern seen in cases involving obsession and perceived betrayal. Rather than seeking resolution, he sought validation, and that pursuit had irreversible consequences. In the hours following his arrest, investigators focused on understanding not just what had happened, but why. The interrogation was methodical and controlled. There were no raised voices, no confrontational tactics. Detectives allowed him to speak. At first, his answers were vague. He spoke in fragments, focusing on emotions rather than events. Betrayal, disrespect, a belief that his marriage had been taken from him. When pressed for details, inconsistencies began to surface. His timeline shifted, his explanations changed. Investigators carefully documented each version, comparing his statements with physical evidence and witness accounts. What became clear was that the journey itself played a critical role in shaping his mindset. 740 miles of isolation gave him time to reinforce his narrative, one in which he saw himself as the victim. Psychologists later described this as cognitive fixation, a process where an individual repeatedly justifies harmful intentions until they feel unavoidable.
As the investigation expanded, law enforcement agencies across multiple states shared information. Correctional officers reviewed security footage and procedures to understand how the escape had occurred. Internal audits followed. Questions were raised about oversight, about staffing, about systems that failed to stop him from leaving the facility unnoticed. Meanwhile, detectives built the criminal case. Evidence was clear: the escape, the interstate journey, the fatal confrontation. Each element supported multiple serious charges. Prosecutors announced that he would face charges related to escape from custody, interstate flight, and homicide. The legal process moved quickly. Given the nature of the case, there was little ambiguity about responsibility. During pre-trial hearings, the focus shifted to his mental state. Defense attorneys argued that prolonged incarceration and emotional stress had impaired his judgment. Prosecutors countered that planning, endurance, and deliberate action demonstrated clear intent. Expert witnesses were called. Psychiatrists testified about obsession, control, and the inability to accept loss of authority within personal relationships. They emphasized an important distinction: understanding behavior did not excuse it. As the trial approached, the victim's family prepared for a process they never wanted to face. They spoke about her resilience, her efforts to rebuild her life, her belief that she had finally found peace. Friends described her as cautious but hopeful, someone who believed the past could remain in the past. The courtroom became the setting where two narratives collided, one driven by fixation and anger, the other by loss and accountability. The trial drew attention far beyond the community where the crime occurred. Courtrooms are often quiet places, but this one carried a heavy presence, shaped by loss, accountability, and a story that had already captured national interest. Prosecutors laid out the case with a clear timeline. They walked the jury through the prison escape, the weeks-long journey across state lines, and the confrontation that ended a life. Maps were displayed, distances were measured. Each mile emphasized the level of determination involved. Witnesses testified about the victim's final days, her routines, her efforts to rebuild her life, and the sense of normalcy she believed she had achieved. Correctional officials acknowledged failures that allowed the escape to happen, while emphasizing that responsibility for what followed rested with the defendant alone. The defense focused on emotional deterioration. They argued that years of incarceration, isolation, and perceived rejection had distorted his thinking. They spoke of obsession, instability, and impaired judgment. But prosecutors returned to one central point. This was not a momentary lapse. This was a sequence of deliberate decisions, a choice to escape, a choice to travel hundreds of miles, a choice to confront. After days of testimony, the jury deliberated. When they returned, the courtroom stood still. The verdict was guilty. Sentencing followed shortly after. The judge spoke directly to the defendant, addressing not only the crime itself, but the impact left behind. A life had been taken. A family had been permanently changed. No explanation could undo that harm. He was sentenced to spend the remainder of his life in custody, this time without the possibility of release. In the months that followed, the victim's family worked to find a way forward. They spoke publicly about the warning signs they wished had been recognized earlier. about the dangers of control disguised as devotion, about the importance of taking threats seriously, even when they come from someone behind bars. The case prompted policy reviews within correctional systems, particularly regarding inmate monitoring and escape prevention. It also became a point of discussion among psychologists and criminal justice experts studying obsession-driven crimes. Today, the 740-mile journey stands as more than a statistic. It is a reminder of how fixation can grow in isolation, how unresolved anger can harden into certainty, and how decisions made in pursuit of control can destroy lives far beyond the person making them. For the woman at the center of this story, the future she was building was cut short. For those left behind, memory became responsibility. And for everyone else, this case remains a cautionary reminder that freedom taken away does not always remove danger, and that obsession, left unchecked, can travel farther than anyone expects.